Imagine being told that the walls around you could hear, that the floors beneath your feet had swallowed screams you were never supposed to know existed. That is not a metaphor. It is the truth of Rosemont, a mansion in Cumberland County, North Carolina, where elegance became the camouflage of predation. The year was 1839. The land was still young, America still finding its shape, yet behind the cultivated image of prosperity lay rot so profound it poisoned generations. This is not a tale of folklore, it is not myth. It is a record dragged reluctantly from courthouse archives, whispered through families who preferred silence to shame, and buried beneath the red clay soil that remembers everything. They will tell you that Mercy and Charity Goodwin were blessed, two sisters so beautiful that nature herself seemed to have sculpted them for worship. They will tell you that their tragedy was a singular misfortune, the story of a marriage gone wrong. But the records do not lie. 7 women had already vanished before the Goodwin twins were ever invited into Jeremiah Whitlow's gilded trap. You are about to descend into a story you were never meant to hear, one that blends forbidden history with the very systems of control that still operate around you today. For what is a gilded cage if not the perfect design of every institution that promises protection while demanding your submission? Do not think of this tale as distant. It is not a relic of the 19th century. It is a mirror. What happened to the Goodwin sisters reveals how corruption cloaks itself in wealth, how institutions align to protect predators, and how even family can become a weapon in the machinery of control. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the wedding morning. June 1839, the air heavy with Carolina humidity, 2 identical brides cloaked in white, one name inked onto the legal certificate, the O. They're erased by the silence of convention. Jeremiah Whitlow, merchant, gentleman, benefactor, smiling with pale eyes that had already measured them as specimens. The county believed it was witnessing charity and mercy bound to fortune. What it was truly witnessing was the tightening of a noose around innocence, the perfection of a system designed not to nurture life, but to harvest it. This is where our descent begins. Rosemont was not a home. It was a theater of illusions, built not for living but for observing. Its 40 rooms gleamed with imported mahogany, chandeliers scattered light like diamonds across walls painted in silk, and corridors stretched long and silent as if waiting to swallow footsteps. But if you looked closer, if you dared to listen beneath the polish, you would notice the subtle wrongness. Voices carried too easily from room to room, as if the walls themselves were hollow. Servants never lingered in conversation, their eyes flicking nervously to shadows instead of faces. The air itself felt watched. Mercy and Charity tried to believe they had been rescued from poverty, but the comfort was poisoned from the start. Jeremiah Whitlow treated them not as companions, but as rare artifacts in a private collection. "You must preserve your perfection," he would murmur, his pale gaze never softening. Daily routines were imposed like military drills, morning walks to maintain posture, afternoon rests to protect complexion, evening baths of milk and honey to ensure their skin reflected light without flaw. Gifts rained upon them, gowns of Charleston silk, French perfumes, imported jewels, but each was less a token of affection than a chain disguised as luxury. To refuse would have been unthinkable. Then came pregnancy. By autumn, both sisters carried children, and with that came Whitlow's feverish obsession. He hovered like a priest over holy relics, demanding constant examinations by Dr. Harrison Fletcher, a man whose trembling hands betrayed the secret shame that chained him to Whitlow's will. "The bloodline must be perfect," Whitlow would whisper to Fletcher, as if the children were not lives but projects, commodities awaiting inspection. Imperfection, he declared, would not be tolerated. The sisters laughed nervously at his intensity, tried to soothe their growing unease by telling themselves that men of wealth were always peculiar. But in their private moments, when the house was quiet and the candles burned low, they confessed their dread. Mercy dreamt of babies crying behind walls. Charity dreamt of women calling from beneath the floors. They woke with pounding hearts, clutching each other's hands, whispering that it was only nerves. But the truth was already clawing its way into their minds. Rosemont was not a sanctuary. It was a machine, one that had consumed 7 women before them, and the gears of that machine were already turning toward the Goodwin twins. It was Charity who first discovered the hidden door. A misaligned book on the shelf of Whitlow's library shifted under her touch, and with a groan of ancient wood, the wall cracked open to reveal a stairway spiraling into the earth. Against every instinct for survival, she lit a candle and descended. The air grew damp, the clay walls sweating as though the house itself was alive, breathing with secrets. And then at the bottom she found them, the relics of the forgotten. 7 women, erased from history but preserved in fragments. A wedding dress faint with lavender. A journal with words that ended mid-sentence. A music box whose tune wavered like a sob. On the wall, names scratched into clay by desperate fingers. Margaret Crawford, Sarah Henley, Rebecca Patterson, Anna Louise Mackenzie, Catherine Vaughan, Eleanor Pierce, Helen Gardner. 7 lives, 7 wives, each consumed by the same ritual of charm, captivity, pregnancy, disappearance. And in that moment, Charity understood. Rosemont was not a use. It was a slaughterhouse, a vault for trophies, a laboratory for a man whose obsession with perfection was merely the surface of something more monstrous. Above her, footsteps echoed. Jeremiah's voice, gentle as a father speaking to a child, floated down the stairwell. Charity, my perfect one, where have you wandered? Panic nearly froze her heart, but she climbed back into the light, carrying the weight of forbidden knowledge. That night she whispered the truth to Mercy, both sisters huddled together like prey animals cornered by a hunter. They spoke of escape, of leaving under cover of darkness before Whitlow realized what had been discovered. But the very next morning, their illusion of freedom shattered. Samuel, the groundskeeper, appeared wherever they walked. Mrs. Donovan hovered, too eager, too attentive. Even Dr. Fletcher lingered daily, not as a healer, but as an overseer. The sisters were no longer wives. They were livestock. Their pregnancies had made them valuable assets in a system they had only begun to comprehend. For Whitlow's plan was not about family, it was about commerce. Women were the vessels, children were the product, and wealth was the altar on which they were sacrificed. This is where you must begin to ask yourself, how many systems today operate under the same disguise? How many gilded institutions promise care while extracting value from your very life, reducing you not to a person but to a unit, a specimen, a commodity? Rosemont is not gone, it has only changed its form. It was Mercy who collapsed first. Winter had barely touched the Carolina soil when her body gave way under the weight of twin lives inside her. The household erupted into a frenzy, though not of compassion, of calculation. Servants rushed to fetch Dr. Fletcher, Jeremiah paced like a general at war, and Mrs. Donovan prepared the birthing chamber with a precision that suggested practice. Too much practice. When Fletcher arrived, his eyes darted to Whitlow before he even approached Mercy. There was no privacy, no tenderness. The birth was not a sacred event but a procedure carried out under surveillance. Charity sat at her sister's side, clutching her hand as Mercy screamed, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Hours dragged into a night soaked with sweat and blood, until finally the cries of newborns filled the chamber. 2 infants, boys, pale-skinned, wailing with the force of survival. For a fleeting moment, joy bloomed. The sisters held each child as though light itself had taken form in their arms, but then Jeremiah stepped forward. He did not smile. He examined the babies like livestock, tilting their heads, studying their limbs, inspecting their eyes, and then, in a voice stripped of humanity, he spoke. This one is sound. Charity never forgot the way he said it. Not beautiful, not blessed. Sound. As if life itself were reduced to the language of trade. The other child, though healthy, was deemed fragile. Whitlow's gaze hardened, and a signal passed to Mrs. Donovan. Within hours, the second infant was gone, whisked away, never to be seen again. Mercy wept until her body shook. Charity demanded answers, begged for truth, but Whitlow silenced them both with a single statement. What is imperfect must not endure. You were chosen for perfection, and perfection must be preserved. It was then that the sisters understood. The children were not theirs. They belonged to him, to the system he had built. Mercy's womb had been the vessel, her body the soil, but the harvest belonged to Whitlow. In the weeks that followed, Charity watched her sister wither, her laughter hollow, her eyes emptied of light. Rosemont's walls absorbed the grief like they had absorbed so many cries before. And still, Samuel the groundskeeper stood watch. Mrs. Donovan recorded every detail in ledgers, and Dr. Fletcher returned with quiet compliance, his trembling hands marked by complicity. The machinery of Rosemont was now undeniable. Birth and death were not accidents here. They were policies, and policies, as you know, do not die. They replicate. Charity could not stop searching. Her sister's grief had hollowed her, but Charity's grief became fuel, a fever of suspicion that drove her to the edges of Rosemont where shadows hid truths. She noticed the patterns first in the ledgers Mrs. Donovan kept so carefully locked away in the library cabinet. Each page catalogued not household expenses, not inventories of crops or wages, but births. Names of women reduced to initials, numbers scrawled beside them, followed by marks that chilled her. Fit, unfit, retained, removed. It was not a family record, it was bookkeeping for a business. She followed Samuel one night, careful to mask her steps against the crunch of gravel. He carried a crate swaddled in cloth toward the stables, though no horse stirred. She watched him lift a trap door beneath the hay and descend into darkness. Minutes later, he returned empty-handed, his face grim, his shoulders heavy, as though he had just carried a burden into the underworld. Charity dared to approach the place the following day. Beneath the trap door she found a tunnel leading out toward the pines, and there, faintly, the smell of milk, the echo of infants crying. Her stomach twisted. The children were alive, but not in her sister's arms. Later, when Jeremiah departed for Wilmington on business, Charity slipped back into the hidden cellar where she had seen the relics of the 7 wives. This time she pushed further, deeper into passages lined with iron rings set into the walls, as though they had once held chains. And then she found it. A chamber with cribs. Not cribs of comfort, but cages of wood reinforced with iron, lined with straw, each marked with initials, as if tagged for identification. The horror became undeniable. Whitlow was not merely a husband with cruel obsessions. He was a broker. Rosemont was the facade. The true business was beneath the earth, the breeding, selection, and trafficking of life itself. Women lured as wives, stripped of agency, used as vessels. Children judged, sorted, traded like cattle. Those deemed imperfect vanished into the clay. The rest were sold into futures unknown. Charity staggered back to the light, her candle nearly extinguished, her body trembling. She knew now what had become of the missing wives. She knew what fate awaited Mercy, herself, and every child born in that house. But worse still, she knew that Jeremiah Whitlow was not an anomaly. He was connected. This was commerce woven into the veins of power, a network shielded by wealth and silence. And once you recognize such a network, you begin to see its reflection everywhere. Then and now. Jeremiah Whitlow was not a fool. His wealth had not been built on charm alone, but on a predator's instinct, the ability to smell rebellion before it bloomed. Charity noticed the shift almost immediately. The doors that had once opened freely now required keys she did not possess. Servants who once avoided eye contact now tracked her every movement. Even Dr. Fletcher lingered longer in the halls, his visits stretched under the pretense of care, his trembling hands betraying the leash he lived under. It was Samuel, however, who became her shadow. The groundskeeper had always moved with a soldier's discipline, his silence more suffocating than words. Now, wherever Charity turned, in the orchard, on the veranda, even on the path to the chapel, Samuel stood at a distance, sharpening tools, coiling rope, pretending at work while his eyes never left her. She understood then that escape was no longer an option. She and Mercy were prisoners, though the world believed them mistresses of a grand estate. Mercy, fragile from her loss, withdrew into herself. She rocked her surviving son as if he were the only lifeline tethering her sanity. Charity, by contrast, burned with resolve. But Whitlow's cruelty was cunning. He did not confront her suspicion outright. Instead, he cloaked his domination in affection. He would sit at the table praising her beauty, offering jewels, pressing wine into her hand. "You were chosen," he would remind her. "You are not like the others. You must understand the burden of perfection." His words dripped like honey, but beneath them lay iron chains. One evening he led her into the cellar himself. The torches burned brighter that night, illuminating the walls she had once explored in secret. He showed her the iron cribs, the ledgers, the names etched into clay, as though revealing them was not exposure, but initiation. "Do you see, Charity?" he whispered, his pale eyes gleaming. "This is legacy. Weakness must be culled. Strength must endure. You are not victim. You are chosen vessel. Do not betray what is larger than yourself." Charity felt her blood run cold. It was not merely a hidden crime he was committing. It was ideology, a belief system disguised as science, as destiny, as progress. And that was more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty dies with the man. Ideology survives generations. That night, as she lay awake, listening to Mercy's broken sobs, Charity understood the truth. She was no longer simply fighting for escape. She was fighting for survival against a doctrine that demanded her silence, her obedience, and eventually her erasure. Charity had learned something crucial in Rosemont. Silence was its own kind of rebellion. The louder Jeremiah's doctrine rang in her ears, the more she withdrew into careful calculation. Outwardly she obeyed. She walked where he instructed, smiled at the table, even feigned awe when he spoke of legacy. But inside, she was mapping every corridor, memorizing every routine, studying the rhythm of the house as if it were a living enemy whose pulse could be felt beneath the floor. Her first act of resistance was small, but deliberate. She began to speak to the servants, not as their mistress, but as their kin. In whispers exchanged over laundry, baskets and flickers of candlelight, she discovered fragments of their truths. Samuel, she learned, had once been a soldier promised land and freedom for his service, only to find himself bound in perpetual debt to Whitlow. Mrs. Donovan's children lived far away, their welfare purchased by her compliance. Even Dr. Fletcher, with his trembling hands, was shackled by secrets Jeremiah kept of his past, secrets that could ruin his name forever. Every person in Rosemont was a prisoner, some with chains of iron, others with chains of fear. Charity began leaving traces, scraps of cloth knotted in places only the servants would see, silent signals that said, "I see you. I know you suffer too." At first there was no response, but one morning, beneath the hem of her gown, she found a folded scrap of paper tucked into her shoes by unseen hands, 4 words written in smudged ink. "Not all obey him." That night, as Mercy wept quietly with her child pressed against her chest, Charity allowed herself the faintest glimmer of hope. But hope was dangerous in Rosemont, and she knew it. Hope had to be hidden, nurtured in silence, lest it be crushed before it could take root. Jeremiah, meanwhile, sensed a shift he could not name. He prowled the house at night, lantern in hand, pausing at their chamber doors, listening. Charity feigned sleep each time, her breathing measured, her body still. But behind closed eyes her mind was awake, sharpening itself into a weapon. Resistance did not begin with violence. It began with endurance, with the will to keep breathing in a house that wanted to consume every breath. Charity had taken her first step. The question was whether she could take the next before Whitlow tightened his grip to suffocation. Mercy had always been the gentler of the two, her spirit softer, her trust more easily given, but grief gnawed at her until she was little more than a dow with eyes that wandered beyond reason. Nights became the most dangerous. She would rock her infant endlessly, murmuring lullabies that dissolved into broken phrases. Sometimes she whispered names that Charity did not know, names etched on the cellar wall, names Mercy could not possibly have seen. One night, Charity woke to find her sister standing barefoot in the corridor, candle flickering in her trembling hand, whispering, "Helen, Helen, don't cry. I'll bring you back." The baby clung to her breast, wailing as Mercy's voice cracked into sobs. Servants gathered, wide-eyed with terror, as Samuel stepped from the shadows to seize her arm. Charity rushed forward, shielding her sister, pleading for mercy. But Jeremiah arrived before dawn. His fury did not roar. It chilled. He stood in silence as Mrs. Donovan explained the disturbance, his pale eyes never leaving Mercy. At last he approached her, stroked her hair as though she were a child, and whispered, "Fragile things must be handled with care, or broken." The following morning, Mercy was confined. Whitlow decreed that her delicate state required rest, and she was placed in a locked chamber near the eastern wing, her child taken into Mrs. Donovan's care. Charity fought, demanded to keep the baby, but her pleas fell against the wall of Whitlow's authority. "Do not mistake attachment for ownership," he told her. "The child belongs to the future, not to you." Charity's heart raged, but her face betrayed nothing. She kissed her sister's hand through the bars of the chamber door, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Mercy clutched her desperately, begging, "Don't let them take him, don't let them take any more." But already Charity sensed the weight of inevitability pressing down. Mercy's unraveling had made her vulnerable. Whitlow would not tolerate weakness, and Rosemont did not forgive women who bro here beneath its cruelty. Charity returned to her room that night with a new terror blooming inside her. Resistance was no longer just about escape. It was about shielding her sister from being erased, from joining the names on the cellar wall. And yet, the more Mercy faltered, the more Charity feared her defiance would be exposed. For in Rosemont, the collapse of one woman was never just tragedy. It was opportunity. For the machine to tighten its grip, for Whitlow to justify another disappearance. The decision came like a fever. Charity knew she could not fight Rosemont from within its walls alone. She needed the outside world to see what the estate concealed, to tear the mask of elegance away and reveal the machinery of horror beneath. But how? Whitlow's reach stretched across Cumberland County. The magistrate dined at his table, the church elders praised his charity, and even traders in Wilmington bowed to his fortune. Yet still, she believed in cracks, in the possibility that one letter smuggled into the right hands might unravel him. She began with scraps, paper stolen from Mrs. Donovan's ledger book, ink siphoned from Whitlow's study. At night, when the house slept, she bent low by candlelight and wrote in a hand so small it could hide between lines of scripture. She recorded everything, the vanished wives, the children taken, the sellers' cages, the names carved into clay. She wrote not as a wife, but as a witness, her words sharpened into testimony. But sending it, that was the danger. Servants were watched, Samuel's shadow followed her even in dreams, and the post that left Rosemont was inspected by Whitlow himself. Then one evening, as she lingered in the kitchen, the cook's youngest girl brushed past her, slipping something into her hand. A folded scrap of cloth. On it, smudged in ash, were 3 words, "I can help." Charity's pulse quickened. She waited until the house sank into silence, then sought out the girl in the laundry yard. The child's eyes darted like frightened birds, but her voice was steady. Her uncle, she whispered, hauled goods to Fayetteville each month. He could carry letters hidden among the cloth, but only one. Only once. Charity pressed the finished letter into the girl's hand 3 nights later, her heart hammering so loud she feared Samuel would hear it from the shadows. "To the sheriff," she whispered. "Tell him this house is a graveyard." For days she waited, each morning stretched like a noose, each evening a silence thick with dread. Did the letter reach Fayetteville? Would the sheriff act? Or had Whitlow's influence already poisoned every branch of justice? Her answer came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, Jeremiah summoned her to his study. On the desk lay her letter, opened, unfolded, every damning word exposed. His pale eyes glimmered with triumph, not anger. "My perfect Charity," he murmured, tapping the parchment with one finger. "Did you think legacy could be undone with ink?" The study door closed with a soft click, the sound of a coffin sealing. Charity stood frozen as Whitlow leaned back in his chair, the stolen letter between his fingers, a smile that was colder than rage curving his lips. He did not shout. He did not strike her. That would have been too human, too ordinary. Instead, he spoke as though lecturing a child. "Ink fades, words betray, but blood endures." He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the pocket of his coat. "Do you know what you've done, Charity? You've placed your sister in danger." The mention of Mercy hit like a blade. Charity's throat tightened, her mind racing with images of her fragile sister locked away, already teetering on the edge of ruin. Whitlow rose slowly, his pale eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Mercy is weak," he continued, voice low, deliberate. "The house does not tolerate weakness. But you may yet prove worthy. You may yet carry what must endure. Think carefully which role you wish to play, witness or legacy." He called for Samuel then, and the hulking figure appeared without a sound, as though he had been waiting just beyond the door. Mercy was brought into the study moments later, her wrists trembling, her child absent from her arms. Her eyes, once full of softness, were wide and hollow now, terror carved deep into their corners. Whitlow stepped between them, his presence a wall. "One of you will remain the vessel of this house," he said. "The other will be retired. The choice depends on you, Charity. Loyalty or rebellion, legacy or extinction." Charity's knees nearly gave way, but she forced herself upright, every nerve burning. She knew he was not bluffing. Rosemont had swallowed 7 wives already. Mercy's unraveling had marked her as vulnerable, disposable. Charity's defiance had placed a target on them both. She glanced at her sister, who trembled silently, lips forming prayers too faint to hear. In that moment, the weight of every vanished woman pressed upon her. This was not just about Mercy. This was about all of them, about every child stolen, every life erased. But to defy him openly now would mean instant ruin. Not just for herself, but for Mercy too. So she did the only thing she could. She bowed her head. She whispered, "I will obey." Whitlow's smile widened, victory gleaming in his pale eyes. But inside, Charity's silence was not surrender. It was strategy. For obedience, she now knew, could be the sharpest disguise of all. From that day forward, Charity perfected the art of deception. She smiled when Jeremiah demanded it, allowed him to drape jewels around her neck like shackles disguised as finery, and nodded when he spoke of bloodlines and legacy. To any observer, she appeared transformed, no longer the restless wife with questions, but the compliant vessel Whitlow desired. And yet, beneath the surface, her mind sharpened itself into a blade. She learned to listen differently. At the dinner table, when Whitlow entertained magistrates and merchants, she bent her head as though meek, but her ears drank in every word. References to shipments, coded mentions of cargo, veiled discussions of Wilmington traders who owed him debts. She realized that Rosemont was not an isolated nightmare. It was a node in a vast web of commerce where lives were treated as merchandise and silence as currency. She also began cultivating Dr. Fletcher. His trembling hands betrayed a conscience already cracked, and Charity pressed gently against that fracture. "Do you ever dream of them?" she whispered once, when Whitlow had stepped away. The doctor's face drained of color. His eyes flicked to the cellar door as though ghosts clawed at it. Each day thereafter she planted seeds, subtle reminders that his complicity was a rope tightening around his own neck. But her boldest deception was with Samuel. The groundskeeper's eyes were harder than stone, but even stone carries fractures. She feigned gratitude for his vigilance, speaking softly, thanking him for his protection. At first he said nothing, but one night she caught the faintest hesitation in his gaze, a flicker of something human buried beneath obedience. She filed it away like a weapon to be unsheathed later. All the while she visited Mercy in the locked eastern chamber, whispering comfort through the bars. Her sister's mind wavered like a candle in the wind, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in murmured prayers to the vanished women. But whenever Mercy seemed ready to break entirely, Charity pressed her hand and said the words she herself needed to hear. "We are not gone yet, not yet." Jeremiah, meanwhile, believed he had won. He paraded Charity at gatherings, praised her obedience, even began to confide more freely, but his triumph blinded him. He did not see that every smile she offered was a mask, every bow of her head a calculated concealment. Charity was no longer simply a prisoner. She had become a spy within Rosemont's walls, and the knowledge she gathered was more dangerous than any weapon. Dr. Harrison Fletcher had always been a man of trembling hands, but now those tremors betrayed more than age. Charity studied him closely during his visits to Mercy's chamber. He lingered too long at the barred door, his eyes darting to the shadows as if haunted. His silence was brittle, the kind that threatened to shatter with the slightest touch. Charity struck carefully. She spoke not with accusation but with compassion, a tone so soft it pierced where anger would have failed. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she whispered one evening as he checked Mercy's pulse through the bars. "The others, you've heard their cries." For a moment his mask held. He cleared his throat, muttered something clinical, but then his hands betrayed him, shaking violently enough that the stethoscope nearly fell from his grip. Charity pressed harder. "You write their names, don't you? In your notes. You know they are gone, but you cannot forget them." The doctor's eyes met hers, wide, bloodshot, desperate, and in that instant Charity knew she had pierced the armor. Fletcher was not loyal by choice. He was bound by fear, by secrets Whitlow wielded like chains. If she could loosen that grip, even slightly, he could become the first ally within the house. Days later, she left a test. A scrap of Mercy's lullaby written in her hand, tucked into the doctor's satchel when he wasn't looking. If he ignored it, he was lost. If he destroyed it, he was still bound. But when he returned, his eyes brimmed with something she had not seen before. Guilt sharpened into resolve. That night, Charity found a folded note hidden beneath her pillow. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. 2 infants, gone last spring, sold in Wilmington. Donovan keeps the records, burn this. Her heart pounded. Proof. Confirmation that Mercy's missing child and others before him had not vanished into the clay, but into commerce. Proof that Whitlow's empire reached beyond Rosemont's walls. But she burned the note as instructed, watching the flame devour the words even as she carved them into memory. Dr. Fletcher had risked everything to share this truth. He was trembling closer to defiance, and tremors, when aimed correctly, could become quakes. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. One ally could not topple the machinery, but if the doctor could be swayed, others could too. The house that fed on silence might, in time, choke on its own secrets. Samuel was the shadow that never left. Silent, hulking, his presence pressed against the sisters like a wall. Charity had once thought him mute, but she began to realize his silence was deliberate, a choice, a mask. He communicated in nods, glances, gestures so economical they seemed mechanical, yet behind those heavy eyes lay something more dangerous than loyalty: calculation. She studied him from a distance at first. He patrolled the estate with a precision that felt military. Every locked door, every barred window, every stranger who strayed too close, all of it was noted, reported, catalogued for Whitlow. To call him a servant was a lie. Samuel was a sentinel, the keeper of boundaries. But boundaries could be broken. One evening, Charity carried a basket of linens past the stables, feigning distraction. She stumbled deliberately, scattering cloth across the dirt. Samuel appeared instantly, stooping to help her gather them. As he handed her the folded fabric, his rough hands brushed hers. It lasted less than a second, but she felt it. The pause. The hesitation of a man who remembered what it meant to be human. Days later, she tested him again. Passing near the stables, she hummed a melody. It was the same lullaby she had once sung with Mercy, the song their mother had taught them by candlelight. She expected nothing. But halfway through, Samuel stopped his work, shoulders stiffening, head tilting slightly. He knew the song. He recognized it. The realization hit her like lightning. Samuel had seen the children. Perhaps he had carried them, perhaps even comforted them before they were taken. He knew more than he was allowed to say. That night, Charity dared to slip a folded scrap into the pocket of his coat, left hanging on the stable wall. It held only 3 words. "Where is Mercy?" The next morning, she found the scrap returned to her windowsill. Scrawled beneath her words, in a hand jagged and crude, were 2 more, still below. Her breath caught. He hadn't exposed her, hadn't punished her. He had confirmed the unthinkable. Her sister still lived somewhere in the bowels of Rosemont. Samuel was not blind to Whitlow's cruelties. He had simply buried his conscience in silence. Now Charity faced a new terror. If she pressed too hard, she might awaken his loyalty to Whitlow. But if she pressed just enough, she might awaken his guilt. The Sentinel could become the key, but keys, mishandled, could just as easily snap in the lock. If Jeremiah Whitlow was the master and Samuel the Sentinel, then Mrs. Eliza Donovan was the ledger, the memory of the house. Thin as a quill and twice as sharp, she carried herself with the posture of a governess, but the eyes of a hawk. Every purchase, every disappearance, every lie told to neighbors flowed through her meticulous hands. Charity first noticed it when Donovan passed her in the corridor one morning, a stack of papers tucked tightly to her chest. Charity glimpsed a flash of ink, columns of names, dates and numbers, not household accounts, lives reduced to entries. It was said that Donovan had once been Whitlow's tutor, teaching him the arithmetic of commerce. When his parents died and he inherited Rosemont, she remained, shifting from teacher to keeper. In many ways, Donovan was more dangerous than Whitlow himself. He reveled in cruelty. She made cruelty efficient. Charity knew she could not confront her directly. Donovan's loyalty to Whitlow was not born of fear like Fletcher's, nor of silence like Samuel's. It was born of conviction. She believed in the order of Rosemont, believed in the ledgers she kept, as if each line of ink preserved the sanctity of the house itself, and yet obsession was its own weakness. One night, while Donovan dined with Whitlow, Charity crept near the study. Through the crack in the door, she saw the woman's neat hand moving across parchment, the candlelight throwing long shadows across her spectacles. She wasn't merely recording transactions, she was chronicling, as though history itself demanded preservation. The thought sickened Charity and thrilled her. If those records existed, they could damn Whitlow beyond denial. Later, she whispered her discovery to Mercy through the barred door. Mercy laughed bitterly, her voice raw. She writes it all down? Then God himself has placed the rope around their necks. But the danger was immense. To steal those records meant moving under Donovan's watchful eyes, prying open a vault of truth that Whitlow surely guarded with blood. Still, Charity could not ignore it. Fletcher's note had mentioned Donovan by name. Samuel had confirmed Mercy's survival. Threads of resistance were beginning to weave into something stronger. And at the center of it all was Donovan's ledger. The proof, the spine of Rosemont's cruelty. Charity made her choice in silence. If she was to survive, if Mercy was to be freed, if the vanished children were ever to be avenged, she would need those pages. And to claim them, she would have to walk straight into the lioness's den. The study smelled of ink and tallow, a place where the scratching of quills became the heartbeat of the estate. Charity had only ever glimpsed it in passing, but now she lingered, memorizing its locks, its windows, the rhythm of Donovan's movements. She learned that the housekeeper guarded the room with a fanatic's devotion. The ledgers never left her sight, not even at night. She slept in an adjoining chamber, The key hung on a chain around her neck like a holy relic. Whitlow trusted her completely, perhaps too completely. He believed her meticulousness would preserve him, never realizing that records could cut both ways. Charity realized it instantly. Those books were a map of Rosemont's sins, and whoever held them held the truth. Her first attempt was cautious, a test of boundaries. While Donovan busied herself in the kitchens, Charity slipped toward the study door. The brass knob was cool in her hand, but when she pressed, the lock resisted. She bent closer, listening. Inside, she thought she heard faint scratching, as though mice lived within. But the sound was not rodents. It was the steady turning of pages, soft and deliberate. Someone was inside. She fled before being seen, her pulse drumming in her throat. That night she could hardly sleep. Images of those ledgers haunted her, pages inked with names, births, deaths, transactions like butcher's tallies. Perhaps even Mercy's child listed among them, reduced to a figure in Donovan's cruel arithmetic. The second attempt came days later. Donovan, pale and thin, had gone out to the orchard with Whitlow, baskets in hand, feigning the gentility of harvest. Charity seized the moment, slipping into the study with a key she had coaxed from Fletcher's trembling hand, a crude duplicate he had risked his career to copy. The air inside was thick, suffocating with the weight of secrets. The ledgers sat in a row, their spines cracked, their pages heavy with years of ink. Charity opened one at random, and her breath caught. Names. Dozens of them, some scratched out, others annotated with cold notations. Removed. Sold Wilmington. Expired. Her fingers trembled as she traced the words as though touching the ghosts themselves, but before she could read further, a floorboard groaned. She froze. In the doorway stood Donovan, her cell. Her thin frame outlined by the torch she carried, her spectacles glinted, her lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. Curiosity, Donovan whispered, stepping inside, is the first sin of disobedient wives. Charity's heart thundered, but her mind sharpened. She had been caught, yet not undone, for sometimes being caught was the only way to step closer to the fire. The door clicked shut behind Mrs. Donovan, sealing Charity inside the chamber of ledgers. The torch hissed softly as its flame licked the air, casting shadows that danced across the spines of the books. Donovan's gaze never wavered, her spectacles reflecting fire like the eyes of some nocturnal predator. "It is not Whitlow you should fear," she said quietly, stepping closer. "It is the record. Ink does not forgive. Ink does not forget. Every wife who thought herself clever, she disappeared, and still the ledger remained." Charity steadied her breathing, clutching the edge of the table as though to support herself. She allowed her face to flush with shame, let her lips tremble as if caught in guilt. "I only wish to understand him better," she whispered, bowing her head. "A wife must know what burdens her husband carries, must she not?" For a moment, Donovan's thin smile tightened, as though testing the fabric of her excuse. Then she moved past her, running a skeletal hand along the ledgers. "These burdens are not yours to bear. They are mine, and mine they shall remain." Charity risked a glance. The old woman's fingers lingered lovingly on the spine of a book marked with a crimson ribbon. That was it. The master ledger, the true heart of Rosemont's cruelties. Donovan might have let her walk free had she shown fear, but now her obsession betrayed her. She was proud of her record, almost reverent. "I see now," Charity said softly, her voice laced with admiration she did not feel. "It is you who preserves this house. Without you, Whitlow's legacy would crumble to dust. Forgive me, Mrs. Donovan, I did not mean to intrude." The words worked like balm. Donovan's shoulders eased, her chin lifted slightly. She basked in the recognition, mistaking it for submission. But beneath the act, Charity's mind raced. She now knew which volume to seize, which ribbon marked the proof that could shatter Whitlow's empire. Donovan leaned close enough that Charity felt the dry heat of her breath. "You will forget what you saw here. You will not speak of it to him, nor to anyone. If you do, you will join the women whose names do not appear in any book." Charity lowered her eyes, whispering the role she had perfected. "Yes, Mrs. Donovan." Only when the door opened again and she was ushered out into the cooler hall did she allow herself a breath. Her heart thundered, but her lips curled at the edges. She had touched the heart of Rosemont. She had seen where its blood was written. And now, the game was no longer about survival. It was about theft. That night, Charity lay awake, the rhythm of her pulse louder than the cicadas in the trees outside. Donovan's words clung to her skin like cobwebs. "You will forget." But forgetting was impossible now. She had seen the ribbon, seen the trembling columns of names that carried the weight of every vanished soul. To leave the book in Donovan's hands was to allow Rosemont's walls to breathe forever. She began to plan. First came the timing. Donovan was relentless in her vigilance, but even she was flesh. Charity had watched the woman's patterns for weeks, the late hours spent scratching at parchment, the half-hour each dawn when she visited the kitchens to demand tea before Whitlow stirred. 30 minutes. That was the window. Then came the question of allies. Fletcher trembled too easily. He could not be trusted to move quickly. Samuel was another matter. His silence was a fortress, but she had begun to pry at its gates. If she could convince him that the ledger was not just ink, but salvation, perhaps he would risk the house's wrath. And then there was Mercy, locked away, mind-fraying, yet still burning with the ember of defiance. To show her the ledger, to let her see her child's fate written in ink. It would be cruel, but it would also bind her more tightly to the cause. Charity's mind spun through possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. She imagined creeping through the study at dawn, the cool metal of the lockpick Fletcher had hinted he could provide. She imagined Donovan returning too soon, torchlight spilling across her face. She imagined Samuel stepping from the shadows, choosing in that instant whether to betray or protect her. But she also imagined the weight of the ledger in her hands. She imagined tearing its spine open, scattering pages into the world beyond Rosemont, forcing the town, the whole cursed county, to see what had been hidden. Proof that the vanished were not mad women, not hysterical wives, not whispers in the night, but flesh and blood sold like cattle. For the first time since she had entered Whitlow's house, Charity felt not just defiance but hope. Fragile, trembling, dangerous hope. And hope, she realized, was more frightening to tyrants than hatred. She whispered into the darkness, not to Mercy, not to Fletcher, not even to Samuel, but to the house itself. "You may keep your doors locked, Rosemont, but your heart already belongs to me." The theft was no longer a question of if, only when. The dawn came heavy with mist, curling around Rosemont like smoke from a dying fire. Charity rose before the first bell, moving silently through the corridors, her bare feet whispering against the floorboards. In her palm was the lockpick, a sliver of steel pressed into her hand by Fletcher, his eyes wet with fear as he muttered, "God forgive me." She reached the study door just as Donovan's footsteps faded toward the kitchens. 30 minutes. Her hands trembled, but not from hesitation. Each tremor was purpose, sharpening her resolve. The pick slipped into the lock, and with a gentle twist, the door surrendered with a click. Inside, the air was thick with ink and wax, the smell of secrets hoarded too long. She crossed to the shelf, fingers trailing along the spines until they brushed the crimson ribbon. The ledger slid free, heavier than she expected, as though the weight of all those stolen lives pressed against her arms. She opened it just once, just enough to see the names, infants, mothers, wives, scratched out or marked with destinations. And there, on a page dated last spring, she saw Mercy's child. Not dead, not forgotten, sold. Tears blurred the ink, but she closed the book quickly, clutching it to her chest. She had what she needed, proof. But then came the sound she dreaded, a floorboard groaning behind her. Samuel stood in the doorway, broad shoulders blocking the light. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. For a heartbeat, she thought it was over. That he would seize the ledger, drag her to Whitlow, and end her defiance in a single brutal gesture. Instead, he stepped forward, closed the door, and whispered his first true words to her. "Take it. Go." Her breath caught, her heart hammering so loudly she thought the walls might hear. Samuel moved past her, standing guard at the threshold, his massive frame a shield. Charity slipped into the shadows beyond, clutching the ledger as though it were her very life. But the house was not blind. Voices rose in the halls, Donovan's shrill cry carrying through the mist. The book is gone." Charity fled into the labyrinth of Rosemont, the ledger heavy in her arms, her sister's name burning in her mind. The house thundered awake, footsteps, shouts, the clamor of pursuit. Yet in her chest, alongside terror, bloomed a new certainty. The heart of Rosemont was no longer sealed. It beat now in her hands, and for the first time, Jeremiah Whitlow's empire bled. The alarm spread through Rosemont like fire catching in dry grass. Bells clanged from the courtyard, servants shouted, and the hounds were loosed from their chains. Charity pressed herself against the cold stone of the outer corridor, the ledger clutched to her chest, her breath sharp as glass in her throat. The book seemed to burn with weight, as though the names inside screamed to be heard. Samuel's words still echoed in her skull. "Take it. Go." That one moment of betrayal, or redemption, had shifted the earth beneath them. If she could reach Mercy with the ledger, proof would pass into the hands of the only person who had lost as much as she had. Together, they could decide its fate. She darted through the corridors, ducking into alcoves as torches flared past. Donovan's voice cut through the chaos, shrill with fury. "No one leaves. Tear the house apart if you must, but bring it back to me." Her obsession rang louder than Whitlow's rage. For the first time, Charity understood. The ledger was Donovan's soul. To lose it was to unravel her entirely. Charity slipped into the eastern wing, heart pounding, and pressed her ear to Mercy's door. "It's me," she hissed. "I have it." The door creaked as Mercy's pale hand slipped through the bars, trembling as it brushed the leather spine. Her eyes, wild and sunken, widened with something fierce and terrible. She read a single line by the dim light, the name of her stolen child, marked not with death, but with a destination. Wilmington. A sob tore from her chest, half grief, half rage. She clutched her sister's hand through the bars and whispered, "Then we are not finished. Not yet." The sound of boots approached, heavy, determined. Whitlow's voice followed, thunderous and commanding. "Find her! Find my wife!" Charity pulled back into the shadows, the ledger hidden beneath her cloak. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with fury, every candle flickering as though the house knew its heart had been ripped away. And in that chaos, something shifted within Charity. She was no longer simply fleeing. She was no longer merely surviving. She held the weapon that could destroy Rosemont. But the house was closing in, and blood, she knew, would be the price of escape. Jeremiah Whitlow moved like a storm through the corridors, his cane striking the floor with thunderous rhythm. Servants scattered before him, their faces pale, their eyes averted. The master of Rosemont was not accustomed to being defied, and now his voice shook the walls with rage. "My wife thinks herself clever," he snarled, "but she will learn obedience in the earth itself if I must bury her there." Charity pressed herself into an alcove, listening to his footsteps draw nearer. The ledger burned against her ribs, every page a drumbeat of defiance. She thought of the names within it, generations swallowed by silence. For their sake, for Mercy's child, she could not falter now. Whitlow stopped outside the eastern wing, the locked door where Mercy still lingered in the dark. His voice softened, but the softness was more chilling than fury. "Dearest, you've been whispering, haven't you? Feeding your sister's rebellion with your lunacy. Perhaps I should silence you first." Mercy's laughter rang out, brittle and sharp. You will never silence us all, Jeremiah. The walls already sing with the names you tried to bury. The words cut him, and Charity saw it. A flicker of unease in his posture. Whitlow had always relied on control, on obedience enforced by fear. But Mercy's defiance, even from behind bars, revealed a crack in his dominion. He lifted the keys from his pocket. Then let us end this song. Charity's blood turned to ice. She had seconds, perhaps less, before he opened that door and destroyed the last fragile ember of her sister's spirit. Her eyes darted down the corridor. Samuel stood at the far end, his massive frame shadowed by the torchlight. For a terrible moment, she did not know where his loyalty would fall. Would he drag her to Whitlow, ledger torn from her arms, or would he stand in defiance of the master he had served so long? Their eyes met. Samuel's jaw clenched, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Not in refusal, but in warning. The moment stretched thin as wire. Whitlow's hand turned the key in the lock. Charity's body tensed. She would have to act now, before her sister was swallowed by the dark forever. The hunt had reached its heart, and every shadow in Rosemont seemed to hold its breath. The iron key scraped inside the lock, its teeth grinding as Jeremiah Whitlow turned it slowly, savoring the moment. Mercy's breath caught on the other side of the door. Charity's pulse thundered in her ears, louder than the shouts echoing from the far halls. The ledger in her arms felt heavier than stone, but it was also sharper than any blade. She stepped out from the alcove. Jeremiah. Her voice was steady, louder than she thought herself capable of. The word struck him like a slap. He froze. The key halfway turned, then pivoted toward her. The torchlight painted his face in savage hues. Surprise, then amusement, then rage. So, he drawled, cane tapping once against the floor. The obedient wife sheds her skin. His eyes flicked to the ledger pressed against her chest. Fury flared. You dare. Charity lifted it higher, forcing him to see it fully. The truth you buried lives here. Every child, every wife, every name you thought erased. You no longer own silence, Jeremiah. For the first time he faltered. The mask of control cracked, if only for a heartbeat. Then he laughed, low, venomous. And what will you do, Charity? Run into the world with your little book? Who will listen? They will call you hysterical, a mad woman like your sister. And when I put Yaida out in the ground, the ledger will return to its rightful shelf. But Samuel moved then. From the shadows at the far end of the hall, he stepped forward, his boots echoing like a drumbeat. He said nothing, but his presence alone was a declaration. He was no longer Whitlow's sentinel, he was a wall against him. Whitlow's smile faltered. His cane tightened in his grip. You too? He hissed, spittle glinting at his lips. After all I gave you? The air between them thickened, charged like a storm before the lightning. Charity's hands trembled around the ledger, but she held it like a weapon. She was no longer hiding in shadows, no longer whispering in locked rooms. The rebellion had stepped into the open. Mercy's voice rose from behind the door, ragged and fierce. Strike him down, sister. Let the house choke on its own sins. Jeremiah Whitlow lifted his cane as though it were a blade, and Charity, heart ablaze, prepared to face him at last. Jeremiah Whitlow surged forward, cane raised like a cudgel. Charity flinched but did not retreat. The ledger was clutched tight against her chest, her only shield. The blow came down with a crack, splintering wood against leather, the sound echoing through the corridor like a gunshot. Pain jolted her arms, but the book held. Ink and parchment absorbed the strike meant to shatter bone. Whitlow roared, eyes blazing with a madness Charity had never seen so naked. This house is mine. These walls are mine. Even your breath belongs to me. Spittle flew from his lips, his face grotesque in the torchlight. He struck again and again, each blow meant not to subdue, but to annihilate. Charity stumbled back, her spine pressed against the stone wall, sparks of agony flashing through her vision. Still, she held the ledger aloft. Then Samuel moved. The sentinel who had guarded Whitlow's empire for decades stepped between master and wife, his massive hand catching the cane mid-swing. The crack of impact reverberated through the hall, but Samuel did not flinch. He wrenched the weapon free and snapped it across his knee, the splinters falling like kindling at Whitlow's feet. The master's face contorted with disbelief. "You ungrateful beast," he spat, voice quivering with fury. "I pulled you from the gutter. I gave you purpose." For the first time, Samuel spoke clearly, his voice low and steady as thunder. "You gave me chains." The words struck harder than any blow. Whitlow reeled back, but his rage was undimmed. With a guttural cry, he lunged barehanded, seizing Charity by the hair. She cried out as he dragged her forward, nails raking at her scalp. The ledger slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. Mercy's screams tore from behind the locked door, a wild symphony of terror and fury. "No! Do not let him take her! Do not let him bury us all!" Charity clawed at Whitlow's arms, her vision blurring with pain. He forced her toward the stairs that led downward, toward the cellar, toward the earth where secrets were swallowed. "You wanted to join them," he snarled into her ear. "Then you will." But Samuel was there again, hands closing around Whitlow's shoulders, ripping him back with the strength of a titan. The two men crashed against the wall, the sound of flesh and bone colliding like thunder. The ledger lay between them, its pages splayed, ink glistening in the torchlight like blood. And Charity knew the fight for Rosemont's soul had truly begun.